What if there were financial solutions being created by brave and brilliant women, a feminist economic model? A new organization of women is realizing that woman-centered model, lifting up women activists and their real-world solutions for building an economy of our own.
90 years ago, in a famous essay, Virginia Woolf advised a young woman writer that she needed two things, an income and a room of her own. After decades of a pay gap and big money's corruption, we need more than that today. We're creating an economy of our own.
An economy of our own is creating awareness of how rigged the current economy is and how many inspiring solutions are rising because of the work of brilliant women activists.
Women have been cheated and exploited by a mean economy for so long, but that's why we're in the best position to fix it together. And we're starting right now.
The people who have been most excluded by that system are the ones that have the deepest understanding of what has to be transformed. It is from that knowledge that it's very important for them to lead. That is leadership we absolutely have to have.
Screwnomics is my word for the widely applied economic theory, I guess, that women should always work for less, or even better, for free. Together, we can create a living economic ecology. But to do that, we're going to need to make economics far more sexy than it is today. There are feminist economic solutions, real world fixes that are working in communities right now, communities like yours.
An economy of our own is all about creating the space to lift up solutions women are advancing. We're here to celebrate women's way of knowing about money, bring you the work they're doing to shake up the system, and compile critical resources for activists like you who want to bring these kinds of changes into your own communities. Put your head together with us. It's the way we create real solutions, talking together about building an economy that works for all of us. We want an economy of our own. We want it now. And if you do too, join us today at aneconomyofourOwn.org. All right. Thank you, Ripley, for playing the video. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I am Carmen Rios. I'm the digital director at An Economy of Our Own. And I'm very excited to be moderating tonight's conversation with Mary Grant of Food and Water Watch, Marguerite Edelman with Vermont PFAS and Military Poisons Coalition, and Dr. Kathy Day, a sustainability expert who works with climate-challenged agriculture. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Before I let our illustrious speakers introduce themselves, I want to give a little bit of a housekeeping, but I also want to hear a little bit from the folks attending. Go ahead and tell us in the chat who you are, where you're zooming in from, and tell us on a scale of 0 to 10, sort of where you would grade yourself on a knowledge of water, soil, climate, and financialization, which is our big overarching theme of our conversation series this year. 0 being you just came here to learn, 10 being you're probably one of our panelists for the evening. And while you all start chatting away, Ripley, if you want to pull up those slides, I'll get our event sort of introduced for everyone tonight before we start digging in. So here at AEOO, we always begin by just reviewing some of the basic intents and assumptions that we bring to these events. So our assumptions are that money talks in a male voice, that our systems, our rules, our tools were not invented by most of us, were not invented to serve most of us, and at best misname and discount many of us. We come in with the knowledge that Although slavery ended over 150 years ago, systemic racial and indigenous exploitation remains a major part of our economic system. We come knowing that women have always worked, but only for the past 50 years have the majority of women and young mothers been in the modern job market in work for pay. We acknowledge that people of color, fluid genders, people with wombs are business owners and financial managers, and yet that caring labor that they've done for generations is still discounted. We also know that economics, from the Greek oikonomia, literally means household management. So we know that women's know-how can change an economy waged as war to one that wages life. And of course, we come in knowing that growing inequality, environmental ruin, and war's wreckage of the planet and people tells us that we cannot afford more alpha male business only as usual. Next slide. Some of our intentions for today are to grow a full-bodied confidence in your life waging value. So we know that your identity is shaped and strengthened by the discovery of your own economic truth. We honor at these events a way of thinking and learning that seeks out and finds connections in all 5 stages of what Belenky et al. Called women's way of knowing. First, we're safe in silence. Then we listen to received knowledge. We form opinions in subjective knowledge. We ask how differences evolve in procedural knowledge. And finally, we grow our own constructed knowledge, built, not born, through our lifelong learning. And what do we mean when we talk about full-bodied economics? So today is part of our series, as I mentioned, on full-body economics and exposing the ways financialization is shaping our economy and how we can challenge it. So today's economy is complex and abstract. Its language often needs decoding. We often read about economics or the economy, and we might not even know what we're reading or what people are talking about. So sort of the questions we're coming in with are, what will it profit a billionaire if he gains the whole global economy while blind money numbers destroy the Earth's health and vitality? We're here tonight because all life requires material care and attention, including the health of our Earth. And we want to find out how we can count Earth's health and our own productive lives as profits of their own. And sort of spin that concept on its head, knowing that money alone can never really create tangible value. I think there might be one more slide, but maybe there is not.
There is not, no.
Okay, then we're all ready to get going. So thank you all for your comments in the chat. I see some 3s, some 7s, a solid 0. Welcome, Gunnar. I am the facilitator, and yet I am also at a 0. I also started our private equity chat at a 0. The good news is I felt like I ended at a solid 5 to 7. So some 5s, another 0. Ricky herself, our founder, rating herself at a 3. Lynn with a questionable 7. Karen with a 3. I'm glad we're all over the chart. That's exactly how we like it, because we have a lot to learn from our panelists and also each other. Feel free during the conversation to be posting in the chat. If you have questions for our panelists, though, try and save them in the chat, to post in the chat at the end when we get to questions from the audience. I want to leave time for everyone's questions, but I don't want them to get lost in the chat and then I miss the chance to pull them out when it's time for us to start asking those. Oh, Ripley, I'm fascinated. Grew up on a farm, so probably an 8 on the agriculture and a 3 on the economics. Maybe we can balance that out today. And so thank you all for letting me know these things. And with that, we come to these events with our own personal knowledge, as we talked about, from our lifelong learning. I come to the world of economic justice, to an economy of our own, from my own background as the daughter of a single working class mother, as someone who has done a lot of work around gender and economics and class, as well as sexuality and class and race and class in her work as a feminist broadcaster, writer. And we know that we cannot encapsulate what brings our panelists here with us tonight. So we like to always let them introduce themselves. So I'm going to honor the fact that the personal is political and economic by inviting them to share the story of how they came to know and care about their tangible work with Mother Earth. So tell us what sparked your passion. How'd you find your path? And I'm going to pass it first to Mary Grant.
Thank you. I'm Mary Grant, the Public Water for All campaign director at Food and Water Watch. Food and Water Watch is a national environmental organization. We fight for safe food, clean water, and a livable planet for everyone. We work to protect people from the corporations and other destructive economic interests that put profit above everything else. So I'm our Public Water for All campaign director, and for the last 15 years, I've worked at Food and Water Watch. For the first couple of years as a researcher, and then for the last nearly decade as a campaign director. I work with our organizers from coast to coast across the United States on campaigns to support safe, affordable, and publicly controlled water. We work at the national, the state, and the local level. And our theory of change is about holding elected officials accountable to pass policies that protect us from corporate harm. So our theory of change is about bringing people together so that we can hold our elected officials accountable. Our key campaign is the Water Act, the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act, to undo decades of austerity and fully restore federal funding to safe and affordable water for every person across the country. Flint's on my mind recently because on Thursday marks the 10-year anniversary of the start of the Flint water crisis. The Water Act was actually introduced in response to the Flint water crisis, as well as the Detroit water shutoff crisis. It was envisioned to be the way we can prevent another Flint water crisis. But while we've grown so much support for the legislation, more than 100 members of Congress supported in the House and the Senate. It's introduced by Representative Bonnie Watsman-Coleman in the House, Senator Sanders in the Senate. We haven't passed it, and it's not in effect right now. And since Flint, we've seen that there's been Jackson, Mississippi, there's been Pritchard, Alabama, water crisis after water crisis across the country, from small rural communities to large cities that disparately harm Black and Brown communities who are in particular subject to resource extraction. So at the local level, our key battlegrounds are fighting for water affordability and against water privatization. We support campaigns to protect public, local, democratic control of water and sewer systems. This organizing to protect water as a public resource is really what motivates me. I came to Food and Water Watch after college and after interning with a state water organization in North Carolina to look at the harm that water privatization did in local communities. That experience really stuck with me, talking with residents in a small manufactured home park where a large corporation came in, took over the water system, and started charging people separately for water. Previously, people had been paying in rent for their water bills, and then they started getting separate water bills, but there was no notice, no explanation. People thought it was spam. It wasn't translated into their primary language that they spoke at home. And so people didn't pay their bills. They didn't understand what this was. And then more than half the community was shut off from their water service. There was a family who took their young infant out to the stream behind their backyard to bathe, and that infant was hospitalized. So these are the stories that stick with me and motivate me, is through the work and also through the organizing work on the local level with our organizers that make this really important work, because we know what's at stake. It's people's lives.
Thank you so much, Mary. And I'm looking forward to all that we clearly have to learn from you on what we can do to change the water crisis that's facing this country and these communities. And thank you for being here and all the work that you do. Marguerite, I have you up next. Oh, hold on. I think you might be muted.
Yeah, I'll take a dime for every time I do that. Anyways, my name is Marguerite Edelman. I presently serve as the coordinator for the Vermont PFAS, per and polyfluoral alkali substances military poisons coalition here in Vermont. Ours is a completely volunteer coalition. Not paid. It's made up of individuals and groups who are committed to the issue of PFAS and the interconnection of PFAS to many other issues, water, air, soil, and you name it. I'm not an environmentalist by nature or a scientist. I was actually, when I was working, a not-for-profit administrator and educator, working at one point for the Cook County Department of Public Health in communications and education. But when I retired, I suddenly had this great opportunity to start exploring things that I cared about. And I became a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom here in Vermont, the Burlington branch, and started working on various projects. And then I got involved with WILF, Women's International Peace and Freedom Earth Democracy Committee. And I was asked if I would write some grants. And I decided that, yeah, that would be kind of a cool thing to do. I'd done it in my career. And so I wrote a grant for Pat Elder, who had a website and was a WILF member. And the website was called Military Poison. And it was a grant to do a tour of California that had the most military bases in the US. And many of them, all of them actually, contaminated with PFAS and other toxins. And that was the first I had heard about PFAS. That triggered in me an interest in whether PFAS was here in my own city, here in Vermont, and near me with the Vermont Air National Guard. And so I started doing my own research and did discover that we had huge amounts of PFAS at our Air National Guard base and at a number of other sites in Vermont. And that was going into the Winooski River, which flows right by my house, where the salmon hole is, and where many of our new Americans, and immigrants, because we're a refugee resettlement community, fish, and high levels of PFAS right here outside. So I started learning more about PFAS and its connection to so many things, like the F-35s, which was of interest to me to see if we could stop them here in Burlington. And when I started learning, I realized how complicated this subject was of PFAS. In fact, a recent study said that over 8% of Americans really don't even know what PFAS is, if you were to ask them. So the fact that they are being contaminated without their consent, and that PFAS is present in so many places and so many products in our air, in our water, in our soil, I found it absolutely shocking and upsetting. And I kept thinking about my little granddaughters, and what I was learning was that this is going to be with us forever. That PFAS are chemicals that take hundreds, if not thousands of years to decompose, and that they bioaccumulate in living beings, and that they are highly, highly toxic. And when I started the work a few years back, they were hardly regulated at all, and that the EPA was doing almost nothing, and that states were really the ones that were taking the lead. So the complication of the whole topic of PFAS and learning about it kind of became my reason for the coalition. And we took on two major purposes. One was education, and the second one was advocacy. And that we decided that the military, which is one of the major contributors around the world, not just in the US, of PFAS, we needed to extend beyond the military. We needed to keep our focus there, but we needed to broaden it out. And that's what we did. We started looking at and reaching out to groups that had a wide variety of interests. So we looked at the whole issue of global warming and how PFAS ties into that. Wastewater treatment plants, drinking water, biosludge in farming, pesticides, multiple industries and businesses that use PFAS chemicals, plastics, which is the theme of this year's Earth Day, Earth versus plastics, tracking, and so many products, from menstrual products to makeup, to children's diapers, to cleaning products, etc. So we kept that larger focus and started reaching out to other groups so that we could work together. We really felt like so many of the groups were in silos, and that they stayed in that silo and they didn't see the commonalities that they had. So the coalition kind of came together with the idea that there would be things that we could work on jointly because they were all interconnected, whether it was pesticides and PFAS or landfills and the leachate that had PFAS in it, the biosludge that was affecting farms and ruining some organic farmers because forever chemicals might have been there before they actually bought the farm and hoped it would be organic, and then had that ruined like some farmers in Maine. So we work at the state level. We've been working on legislation here successfully to try and get stronger laws, but also to educate the public and our legislators on what PFAS is. And we've really become interested lately in where government grants and state grants and contracts are going, and also tax breaks. So for me, it's become a passion that I never expected to have at this point in my life. And, you know, it's work where I learn something new every single day. Sometimes it's very depressing work, but often I find myself empowered and wanting to share that information with others. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for being here tonight to share some of that information with us too. And of course, last but not least, Kathy, we would love to hear from you too.
Thanks. So my name is Dr. Kathy Day, and I'm a climate change sustainability consultant in the area of climate change and agriculture. And I also work for the Agricultura Cooperative Network and La Cosecha, that are sister organizations in the South Valley of Albuquerque. And La Cosecha and Agricultura together work to make increased food access happen in the South Valley as well as in New Mexico more broadly. So we serve to bring food from New Mexico farmers and get it back out, especially to institutional buyers, as well as to low-income members of the local community. And so what that means is, in order to make that happen, we've been big participants, and this is work that has preceded me as I recently came into the organization, but we've been big participants as an organization in getting state policy to build on federal policy that allows for local food to be bought and sold back out to institutional buyers. That's been a huge change that's happened in the New Mexico legislature, and it is the reason that we're able to keep a local food economy cycling and really regrounding it here in New Mexico. So that's made a big difference both for the South Valley and for New Mexico more broadly. I've been involved with agriculture and climate change in one way or another for 20 some years, from being a Peace Corps volunteer in Niger to working with farmers in Florida and New Mexico on how they were dealing with climate change. I've worked in federal policy the last few years, and so I'm circling back to working with farmers again here in New Mexico because I believe it's so vital that we get climate solutions on the ground and help farmers to implement for themselves. And that means for our New Mexican farmers, it's not only a question of implementing solutions that are going to help minimize the future greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, which I believe is a huge bonus of working in agriculture. We're one of the few industries in which there is great potential for mitigating greenhouse emissions very directly by getting them into soil and into plants. But New Mexican farmers are also those who struggle with a great deal of climate impact. We saw that more than ever before last summer when we had farmers here in Albuquerque and in surrounding areas who were dealing with 95-degree-plus temperatures for days on days in a row. And not only, of course, do they as workers suffer, but their crops also suffered very substantially last year. So we saw a lot of people who lost a lot of their crops or who had stunted crops, tomatoes that never really produced. So it was a very hard summer last summer in Albuquerque. And so some farmers are feeling like they're really seeing the reality of climate change for the first time here. And so a lot of what I'm here doing is educating trainee farmers as well as our current farmers in our network that's mostly made up of Indigenous, Hispanic, and other local farmers, and trying to give them the supports that they want and need in order to move into a climate change future that's going to be increasingly challenged by these conditions. So that's really my main focus, but I'm interested in all things climate change, I would add.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am so excited to talk to all three of you. And I feel like we should start with a lay of the land, pun intended, by digging in a little bit to the state of things in all these different areas that you all are specialists in. And so I was thinking we could start with water, since life as we know it depends on water. And yet lately, as we heard, water is becoming increasingly a problem, a challenge. Safe water, clean water, dangerous water. We're seeing increased droughts and floods and toxins in our water because of climate change and economic destruction. And of course, access to water is increasingly difficult because of climate change. So water was traditionally considered a common good. Here in the US, sanitation and safety came with shared government oversight. But in the 70s, free market ideas about water and its management transformed it into a commodity. So, Mary, I'm curious, you touched a lot on this in sort of your introductory remarks, but I'm curious about if you could sort of stretch how that change and that idea of water as a commodity is really impacting us, and what the power might be of, bringing back this idea of water as a common good, water as a human right, as you talked about.
Yeah, of course. So there's a lot of market forces out there that are trying to create this idea that water is an economic good. It is a commodity, something to be traded on the market, going and allocated to the highest payer. And that is not the way we should allocate water. And this really has its origins, and I think that it reached the international stages in the 1990s, the early 1990s. There was a meeting in Dublin, and they promoted this idea about water as a market good, an economic good, and that it should be allocated based on pricing. But we know what happens when water is allocated to the highest bidder, the highest buyer. It means that you have wells going dry in farm worker communities, right next to green golf courses, right next to factory farms and mega dairies, right next to oil and gas drilling. So water is a public trust resource. It is not a commodity. So in the United States, if you live east of the Mississippi River, typically your water is allocated under what is known as riparian rights. If you're west of the Mississippi, often you have an actual water rights system. And this water rights system has its origins back in the gold rush in the 1800s, the early 1900s, and senior rights and junior rights. And there's a lot of conflict right now over the Colorado River and rights to the Colorado River. The states have to come together and make up a plan, but no one's talking about the abuses of the oil and gas industry, the abuses of big agriculture out west, and how they're the major users of water, and how a lot of that water is going to cash crops and not to sustainable small farms. So to back up a little bit, so a commodity is an economic good sold to the highest bidder. Water does not fit that model. It cannot be considered a commodity because not only is it necessary for life, like food is necessary for life, but water is necessary for life, but water has no substitution. If water gets too expensive, water is the new oil. If water becomes more expensive than oil, you can't drink oil, right? There is no substitution for water. Water is not an economic good, and it cannot be treated like an economic good. It is a public resource that needs to be managed by the public for the public good. And it's not only about how it allocates it to the highest bidder. So it's the special properties of water make it uniquely unsuited to allocation through the market mechanisms. Water is essential for life, and commodifying water it treads on the basic concept of the human right to water. So it's very different, and water is also heavy. So there's this push to privatize water, but more water utility systems. It really took off, well, under Reagan, there was austerity. So Reagan cut away most of the grant programs for our water infrastructure. By the end of his term, he phased out the construction grants, replaced them with low interest loans, the state revolving loan program. So this really gutted a lot of the resources available to our public water and sewer systems. And it led to a wave of privatization in the 1990s, particularly under the Clinton administration as well, issuing some executive orders that greased the wheel on privatization. We had a lot of utility systems privatized in the late 90s, early 2000s that were really disastrous. So you have Atlanta with Suez, which is now Veolia, and they merged together. And it was just a huge disaster when utility systems were privatized. Water utility systems themselves are being attacked by privatization, but water, again, it's not a good fit for the market because water utilities are natural monopolies. Water is very heavy. It's heavy to move, so you can't, and it's very expensive to treat and deliver. So you can't have two sets of pipes going in. There's no competition. You only have one utility provider. So the market mechanism does not work for water, does not work for water utilities. And bottled water is one way that corporations have sought to commodify water, to turn it into a commodity that can be traded on the open market. But bottled water companies aren't selling water. Most of that water in bottled water is filtered tap water. You can filter it at home. What bottled water companies are selling is plastic. On this theme of Earth Day, where we need to fight plastic waste, bottled water is no solution. And it's not, again, a replacement for having tap water at home for cooking and bathing, flushing your toilet, growing food. So bottled water is not an alternative for having water resources managed by people and for the public. I think I might not have answered all parts of your question, but I wanted to get at that idea that water as a commodity is it's a ridiculous concept. Water is not a commodity. It should not be subject to the market forces. It needs to be managed by people in the public interest for the public good.
Thank you so much. You did an incredible job answering that question. Thank you for giving us that long view of sort of how we got here. I know we'll dig into solutions too as we move forward. I also forgot and then realized as Mary was talking that we do have a curriculum document with some resources for further learning, but also with some helpful, definitions and terms in it. I'm going to let Stephen drop that link to that document in the chat if it's helpful at all while our panelists are speaking, to sort of refer to anything in there. I'm just want to make sure that everyone has access to it. And so now that we've talked about water, Kathy, why don't we talk soil and land? Long before water, land became a commodity, privatized as property, product for sale, used for farming, but also for development. So sort of how did we get here and where are we with access to land and the way that we are treating land because of financialization?
Yeah, well, I would say financialization, first of all, to start at the end, is just the end of a long train that's been going on for quite a long time. The very beginnings of agriculture in this country were a question of taking land from the existing peoples and turning it into privatized land. And so it was imposing outside European models upon the land models that already existed. And what we see with the change that's happened with that over time is that oftentimes that private land ownership has removed land from those who had the most knowledge of the land, those who had the deepest relationship, and those who therefore were able to make the wisest environmental choices because they understood in depth the ways that they could work that land. And with financialization, we're getting ever closer to a situation where we have fewer and fewer of the youngest farmers and the most marginalized farmers able to access land. So as financialization and investment by those who want to place their money somewhere and get some benefit over time without any interest in the land itself, with that situation, we're seeing that land prices just keep rising. And as a result, we see that lots of young farmers, lots of farmers of color and others who are very interested in the kinds of farming that help to diversify the landscape, that decrease greenhouse gas emissions, that decrease the impacts on water quality, all of those kinds of folks are finding it very difficult to access land. Perhaps they're able to rent, or perhaps they're able to borrow, but oftentimes they cannot own, which limits their ability to make long-term decisions for those landscapes. And so from starting with the history of stealing land from people, as well as, I would add, stealing labor, which is what we have built the American agriculture system upon for a very long time, because during the enslavement period, labor was being stolen as the land was being stolen. So the labor of Black Africans eventually became the replacement for the indigenous peoples that were originally used. And that has impacted the shape of our agriculture policy up to today. And so the combination of those two has meant that those who have the deepest relationships are most often those with the least access to being able to make decisions about land, and to making the kinds of decisions that in many cases are deeply thoughtful, informed, and caring decisions that are looking at ecological relationships in a very deep and careful way.
Thank you. And, you know, Marguerite, of course, as we are talking about all of this, from soil to the water in our bodies, I feel like we're talking plastics, and we need to talk PFAS as well. Can you explain, you know, what we're facing? Someone remarked when we were collecting questions for this event, one of our attendees remarked that, you know, financialization has, they said, turned finance upside down, so that instead of finance enabling the material economy, financialization has become a self-serving parasite. I felt like it was a very appropriate sort of jumping off point for this question of how profitability as well as convenience, another commodity that we are sold in a capitalist world where our time is increasingly taken up by making money to survive. How does that all get in the way of Earth health? And how do you sort of see that happening, or see the history of that in the work that you've been doing?
That's a great question, and it's really broad. So I want to just begin with a little more background than I gave in my introduction. But per and polyfluoral alkali substances are a class of 15,000 plus chemicals. They have the strongest bond in chemistry, and they take a very, very, very long time to degrade in the environment. That's why they're called forever chemicals. And the different terms that we use for them are what also make it complicated and hard for people to know what we're talking about. They were actually developed during the Manhattan Project, PFAS, the first ones, because they have these amazing qualities. They are heat resistant, water resistant, grease resistant, you know, and then they have many, many new strategies that they're used for in various processes. We have not in this country regulated them. And the EPA has really been lax in its job of regulating PFAS chemicals. And it's more and more that we're learning that these chemicals are extremely toxic, that they interfere with our immune systems, our hormones, they're hormone disruptors. They impair reproduction, and in some cases cause infertility. They damage our livers, and they cause all forms of cancer that you can imagine. With 15,000 chemicals, it's even been shown that different ones attack different organs. Now, all of this makes it very difficult to prove that a particular chemical or a particular form of PFAS is a problem. In general, what the U.S. has done, EPA has actually there were actually no like standards, maximum contaminant levels for what could be in your drinking water. And probably you've all been reading recently about PFAS in drinking water across the whole country. The EPA finally, because the Biden administration put together a PFAS strategic roadmap, has finally established drinking water standards. Of course, they're not going to take effect for 5 years, probably. That's how long most of the drinking water suppliers will have to actually enforce it. And it basically takes just 6 forms of PFAS. Remember I said there were 15,000? So we're in this kind of whack-a-mole thing in the US. Europe is looking at the bigger picture, the whole class of chemicals. But, you know, the more we test and the more we look at it, we're finding PFAS in the water. We're finding PFAS in the soil. And we're finding PFAS in products you wouldn't even guess it should be in. And that's what's absolutely so frightening about it. PFAS is extremely cheap overall. It only costs like $50 to, let's say, $1,000 for a pound of PFAS. But ironically, what it costs to clean up that pound of PFAS is 2.7 million to 18 million per pound to remove it. And that's just to remove it from municipal wastewater. So removing PFAS from US drinking water, now that we have finally some standards for at least 6 forms of PFAS, could add more than $3.2 to $7 billion annually to taxpayers. And then there's the health-related costs, because we know now, because the stories are coming out, about the link between PFAS and testicular cancer, for example, in firefighters, and the military with brain cancers and other forms of cancer. So the worldwide, the estimates for healthcare in just the US are 5.5 to 63 billion annually. And the annual cost worldwide for PFAS, because it's a worldwide problem, is 17 trillion. So in other words, it's cheap to buy. These companies, you know, are using it, and it's so cheap to use and to buy, and has all these great convenient purposes. But the cost to us and the future generations is going to be absolutely astronomical. And the truth is, they're forever chemicals. We cannot yet remediate them. We can filter them, and we can bury the filters, but the truth is that they're still here. They haven't gone anywhere. We've just moved them from one place to another. And until we actually have a method for destroying them, we are seeing them increasingly across the globe in polar bears in the Arctic. Just the other day, there was a story that said that the ocean spray, if you want to take a beach vacation, contains more PFAS than what comes out of some industrial plants and air emissions. So literally, we are beyond, science says, our capacity to handle the amount of PFAS unless we turn off the tap. And people simply don't know this. That's the biggest problem that we have, because it's been added, because there haven't been laws banning it, to almost everything we use. Dental floss, cleaning products, it's in rugs, it's in your sofa, it's in your mattresses, it's literally everywhere. And so for us, this is convenient, right? You know, we can do all these things and they're easy. Plastic also contains PFAS. 68 forms of PFAS have been found in plastic packaging, plastic bottles, plastic containers. PFAS is now added to pesticides, so it's in our food. We're literally poisoning ourselves. And, you know, that's what worries me, you know, that, you know, if we don't turn off the tap soon, if we don't really start looking at enforcing bigger regulations than just a whack-a-mole one at a time, because legislation takes a long time. I can tell you that from hearing the work in Vermont. It takes forever. And if you're going to legislate one PFAS at a time, you're going to be going at this for a very long time. And 15,000 isn't the actual maximum amount of PFAS that could be created. Scientists are saying they could do quite a few thousands more. So it's absolutely frightening to me. Here in Vermont, 4 in 10 Vermonters don't drink public water, Mary. They have wells or spring water. And what's frightening about that is our state doesn't test those wells, through the Department of Health for free. So here again, you have individual taxpayers having to shell out the money for a relatively expensive certified PFAS water test. And then if they discover PFAS, then they still have to filter it. And ironically, the tests that we have right now can't detect below, in some cases, 4 parts per trillion, or at least that's where the federal government has set the limit at. So that means that you could still have PFAS in your water if it says no detect. And it would still be considered toxic because according to the EPA, the lifetime health advisory is basically 0 parts per trillion of at least the 2 most common forms of PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. So just a quick thing on what I would call profitability for the businesses and the cost for us as the public and as government to clean up this mess. And the military is probably our biggest contributor to this around the world, with every single base and the number of communities that it has poisoned.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. Sure, I'm not the only one stunned into silence right now by what we all just learned. And also, I feel like something that was very interesting to me about some of those numbers you just walked us through is that there's obviously a moral imperative, a social justice imperative. I think when those of us who are here are listening to the 3 of you talk about land and farming, water access and safety, toxic chemicals that are being added to our stuff to lower costs and increase market value for products that are being sold to us as consumers. There's obviously, we feel in our heart that these things are wrong, but you really drew out this economic case that, it might cost $50 to buy a pound of these, but it's going to cost us billions, trillions of dollars to clean them up, not to mention how much cost is passed to us as consumers of these products when, these toxic chemicals start impacting our quality of life in a country that doesn't have a good healthcare system or community care as a defining part of our social fabric. And so I think that's sort of a general question too that I have that I'd love to pass to all 3 of you is, when we think about changing an economic paradigm and making a healthy ecology a central part of a healthy economy and recognizing that it has to be a part of a healthy economy. I'm curious, how you all think we can redefine profit and sort of take away this idea of these public goods and our public safety and health being commodified. What do you see as that new economic paradigm? What is a vision that you're maybe motivated by? And sort of how would you rewrite that script in these different areas that you all are specializing and focusing in? And I'm like, anyone can start, but I could also pass them.
I'll jump in. So in the water world, there's already a rally cry that water for people, not for profit. You see it at every water rally, every anti-privatization fight. So water for people, not for profit. So I think that when we think about redefining water, I mean, it's already how we conceive of it historically in the United States as a public resource, a public trust resource. And it's about codifying that into laws and then realizing it. One thing the United States has been really awful at is recognizing human rights and human right to water. There's a real resistance in the United States to acknowledging that every person has a right to live a life with dignity. And part of that is having access for water and sanitation. So as we often think about the alternative to water for profit, water for people, and human rights, it's the human right to water. Water is a human right is another sign you'll see a lot at rallies, fighting for water affordability or against privatization. So I think that communities are already rethinking that, reclaiming water and thinking about it and also thinking about more than that, just democratizing water, like thinking about a water democracy too. It's not just about public, but what is the meaning of the word public even? For a lot of people, it's about reclaiming democracy itself too, because we have so much corporate influence over our politics. We need to reclaim the word democracy and democratize water for people so that we can prioritize the benefits of the many, the public and environmental well-being over just economic gain for a wealthy few.
Absolutely. And Kathy, I'm curious how that intersects a lot with what you were touching on too, when you sort of gave us this overview of, how economics and land use and ownership intersect. I'm curious what a new economic paradigm looks like for you that you're motivated by in this work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated question, but there are a number of areas in agriculture. Land is certainly one of them, and the commodification of the crops themselves that cause problems with how we deal with those natural products of the earth. And generally, I would say we need to move away from the concept of profit much more broadly. Certainly, I cannot see it making sense with water, so much in agreement with that idea. But we also need to consider how private land ownership has been carried, how land ownership, I should say, has been carried out differently in other parts of the world, and how it has been carried out by other peoples who live here and still live here. Because in common systems where everyone is sharing the resource and everyone is making decisions together and cooperating in those decisions, you actually, contrary to what is commonly spoken about, you actually get really good management of those systems. You have people who are giving an opportunity to one another to speak up, to make changes in the rules, and then to really notice what's going on in the landscape and to take care of it. Whereas when we are profiting off of land, what we end up seeing is that there's somebody who's driven by a very singular motive. And granted that it's rare to find a farmer who really has a relationship with the land, who is only going to be driven by profit. But many of them will speak that way because they're told to. The system expects them to. And when they're focusing on profit alone, they might be focusing on putting on more fertilizer, putting on more pesticides, because I'm going to get more output out in the end. Whereas if they're focusing on the value of the life on the land, the value of the crops that they're getting, the way that they're feeding other people, the way that they're offering habitat for birds, for insects, for other mammals, all of those things as a focus provide a very different orientation to what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Profit provides just entirely the wrong motivation. It drives people toward a direction that draws upon resources without building them back up and without acknowledging the ecological reality that everything is connected. So if we step away from profit and if we move towards something that is much more an ethic of care and an acknowledgement of how interrelated all the parts of the system are, I think we get toward, if we want to use the word, an economics that is far more in tune with the ecological systems. Whereas if we stay profit focused and if we stay in what has been narrowly defined as economics in the past, then we end up just doing continued withdrawing of resources without supporting all of the other lives on the planet.
Absolutely.
I would agree with both Mary and Kathy and say that what has kind of excited me is the whole concept of the rights of nature, the rights of community, and looking at kind of a legal jurisprudence theory that gives rights to ecosystems and species, which is kind of similar to, the Declaration of Human Rights out of the United Nations, which of course, as Mary points out, we haven't been very good at doing any of that here in the US. But it's a whole different way of looking at, things. I mean, community rights to me are important because we have communities that don't have the kind of infrastructure that they need, and they're not able to get the government or state funding, federal or state funding. And I could give some examples just here in Vermont that could make a huge difference to what we're seeing in terms of water, in terms of wastewater, et cetera. The other thing I think we need is the whole precautionary principle. We need to base everything in terms of the decision making that we have, not on the information that we lack, because we have to prove everything. We have to prove this particular PFAS is going to cause this, or this is going to cause that before we can take it off the market. In other words, it comes to the market, then we have to prove with taxpayer money that it's it's not good for us. The other option is to say we have enough evidence to prove that almost all PFAS that we've studied cause huge health problems and environmental issues, and therefore we need to ban the whole class of them. That's a whole different way of looking at, not just law, but also profit. I mean, it should be what we see operating in businesses, and it is a precautionary principle too, and operating in choosing to build a new development, and where we choose to build it based on the nature around it and what we could be interfering with in terms of ecosystems. So, that's what I would just throw in too. I think as individuals and maybe as a society, we need to be less consumer and convenience oriented too. I think those two things are absolutely crucial. We've come to rely on having everything so convenient that we're killing ourselves with it.
Mm. Yeah, I think our economy would be a lot different if we were taking more precautions and thinking more about care and long-term sustainability, than what sells or how can we exploit something to turn a fast buck. I think that would really flip so much of our economic model just on its feet. And, climate scientists are obviously now saying what Indigenous people have traditionally believed and said for centuries, which is that, air, land, water, people, life are interconnected, as Kathy mentioned. And I'm curious, for you all, what are some of the small practical things that folks tuning in can do to respect those connections, even in a small way, even in their own lives, that would promote this idea of a healthy ecology that's tied to a healthy economy? And then, of course, we'll talk more about the big scale solutions too. Marguerite, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, I'm looking very specifically in my area, and it's not easy, I admit, at least at this point in time. I hope it gets easier over time. For individuals to be able to, search out products that don't have PFAS in them. There are websites and there are places you can go to get information. The Environmental Working Group has a lot of really good guides. Mamavation has done a lot of really good research and studies and has a lot of stuff that it can share. And there's also just a whole page on PFAS-free products. So we have a lot of them on our website, www.militarypoisons.org, and where you can shop PFAS free. So I think that's one really important thing. I think the other is to educate ourselves. I think we can't just turn the blinders on anymore. You're not going to be able to go into a store and pick up a product and say, oh, this doesn't have PFAS in it. They don't list them. I mean, that's the other thing. Often, they have these long scientific names if they are listed, but there's also the business confidential agreements. So they may not even appear in the list of ingredients in a product. So reading labels, it doesn't make it easy for us. So, there are laws that we should be working on. We should be able to know what's in the products that we buy. to make, to make a big difference. And we should be able to tell manufacturers that we won't buy their product if it has PFAS in it. And when we go shopping, we should ask, does this raincoat have PFAS in it? And you will be surprised that most of those people selling that stuff don't even know what PFAS is. So we have a lot of work to do, but we ourselves individually can pressure for change and can pressure businesses to do things differently. And we ourselves can do things differently as well. Try and avoid plastic packaging when we go to the stores. That's huge. Don't buy bottled water. That's important as well. And I could go on and on, but I'll let someone else speak up.
Mary, what about you?
So for Marguerite said, there are ways you can protect yourself at home from water contaminants. We have a filter guide too, I'm happy to share. And also you can educate yourself if you are on a public water system, learn more about your water system. Every water utility is required to send you an annual water quality report. You can look at that and help make informed decisions that way. Broadly for water, like you don't need to water a lawn. I mean, so much of the United States focus on green lawns has done a lot of harm. You can support local pollinators by letting the wildflowers come back. And we can also, while we live more in harmony through these individual and personal actions, ultimately, I know you said we'll talk about it next, but ultimately we still need that policy change and collective action. So I would also say that practicing a collective way of thinking is also something we can strive for in our everyday life, is trying to move beyond just thinking of ourselves as individuals or thinking of ourselves as consumers or customers, but thinking about ourselves as part of this collective. And that can be part of that transformation that we need to have happen.
I love that. Thank you. And Kathy, what about you? What are the small ways that we can respect these connections between the ecology and the economy?
Yeah. So I talked about this question with some of my coworkers today, who they represent Indigenous viewpoints. So I wanted to hear from them on some of this. And they had some really excellent examples. I want to start, though, just from the perspective of linking together what Marguerite and Mary both said, that education, I think, is a really key piece for all of this. And what I come to is this broad recognition in agriculture, especially, that we are doing things in an early 20th century fashion based on early 20th century science. And the 21st century science is so much more in line with Indigenous ways of thinking that we have from so many sources, from people who are still sharing their oral traditions today, from people who've written down their traditions. We know from sources, very easily available sources like Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. We know so much more clearly not only what the 21st century science says about how everything is connected, but how that set of connections was very reflected in a lot of ways of knowing that existed long before science got around to recognizing them. So for me, that's really an important piece, is to recognize that other ways of knowing have offered some very real, very important ways of understanding our Earth and the connections of things to each other, and have had different ideas about how ecology and economy connect to each other that we can go to right now and ask for advice and take direction from. And we have plenty of published sources that are great places for all of us to start. I would certainly point to Braiding Sweetgrass as one of those. And then also sources that just dig into that science and how the science has changed so radically, like Finding the Mother Tree, that has brought out those connections between trees and fungi and really helped us understand that everything really is working together within the systems. So I would say we have to start by, one, acknowledging the existing wisdom, existing knowledge that is sometimes very separate from the research-based science that we've done, but yet has done much of the same work over thousands of years. And we have to read some of the sources that are most available to us and start to learn about how we should be understanding our world differently.
Thank you so much. All great ways for folks to sort of take this journey into their own hands and become part of that collective, like Mary talked about. And on that note, I would love to hear about those larger scale solutions, the movements and the solutions, the policies, that are keeping you all hopeful and that you are motivated by and working toward. What are some of those big picture ideas, those bigger goals that we need to keep focused on and that folks tuning in should be pushing for as well? Mary, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Happy to. For water, there's three I'm going to mention tonight at the federal level. The first one is the Water Act that I mentioned before, the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act. It would restore the federal government's commitment to safe and clean water in every community. It would fully fund our water systems at the level that the EPA says is necessary to comply with existing law. Marguerite talked about earlier about the cost of PFAS, complying with the new PFAS MCLs or regulations and for getting it out of our drinking water. As those costs go up, as we remove lead pipes, as the lead and copper rule gets strengthened, hopefully that'll be finalized, and we remove PFAS, all of those costs should be paid for by the federal government. It would restore that commitment to safe and clean water. Federal funding peaked in 1977, and since then it's declined by 77% in real terms and 84% on a per capita basis. And it would do that by rolling back just a tiny portion of the Trump administration's corporate income tax cuts. So just a 3.5 percentage point increase to the corporate income tax rates could fund water systems in every community across the country to comply with federal law so that we wouldn't have communities with arsenic in their water, we wouldn't have lead pipes in place, we wouldn't have PFAS contamination. Just that tiny rollback of the corporate income tax cuts that the Trump administration did not too long ago. So that's real money, it's there, and it's just a statement of our priorities as a country. I mean, this is $35 billion a year. It sounds like a lot, but if you look at the aid packages passed over the weekend for wars in other countries, that it's not that much money in the scale of things. It's real money and it's there, and we can do it. So we are advocating for the Water Act. I can put a link to it in the chat. The other one I want to mention, like Margaret was talking about, the new PFAS MCLs and regulations. We're advocating also for the PFAS Action Act. It's actually bipartisan legislation in Congress, and it would keep the pressure on the EPA to continue to regulate these compounds. Like Marguerite says, just 6 out of thousands of chemicals were regulated under the new drinking water limits. So we need Congress to pass the PFAS Action Act to ensure that we're stopping the introduction of new chemicals onto the market, as well as to make sure EPA to look at regulating it as a class of chemicals, and also to provide legal clarity, because we're already hearing, suspecting that some of the chemical companies might be suing to stop these new regulations. So passing this would give legal clarity for those actions by EPA. And the last one I want to mention on the subject of water financialization, just last week on Thursday, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Ro Khanna introduced the Future of Water Act to ban water futures trading. We haven't really talked about it. Futures trading is a little wonky, but it's the financialization of our water at its peak. It's very, it's very upsetting to think about how financial speculators are gambling on water in California. So this new legislation from Senator Warren and Representative Khanna would ban futures trading of water and water rights, and it would also define in federal law that water is not a commodity. So it's a very important piece of legislation to protect against the commodification and the financialization of our water.
Thank you so much. Marguerite, go for it.
Okay. Well, I was definitely going to agree with Mary that we need to do a whole lot more with banning PFAS. I'd like to see us move in the direction of the European Union, which is looking at banning 10,000 forms of PFAS, and they've been having hearings on that and looking at that as an issue. Because I think that sends a very strong message that we expect to see change. They're getting pressure. I know Food and Water Watch has done a wonderful study on the chemical companies' use of lobbying money to basically gut kill and postpone all legislation related to the chemicals that they use. Here in Vermont, we've seen some of those chemical companies coming in to fight the legislation we've been working on, which is a bill called S-25, which would include finally, but not enough, as always, bans on PFAS and children's products and textiles and astroturf. We'd be probably the first state that would be banning our PFAS in artificial turf, and menstrual products, makeup, and the list goes on and on. I'd also like to see us start funding safer alternatives. Once again, in Europe, they have an organization called ChemSec, which is the International Chemical Secretariat. And they have a website that has tools that industries can go to find safer alternatives for the uses of various chemicals that are being used by their industries. So you could go to it and see if there's an alternative. There have been safer alternatives developed for things like microchips. And that brings me to another area. I think we have to be really careful that we don't pit climate change against our environment, that the sustainable energy solutions that we're coming up with aren't also contaminating the earth. We know for a fact that solar panels, wind turbines, electric cars, and so much of our electrical stuff uses PFAS. And a huge number of federal grants are being given, the Big Chips program are being given to companies to manufacture semiconductor chips, for example. I'm just using one example. And they gave them 52, I think it was $52 billion in federal investments. They gave the Department of Defense, once again, for basically missiles and all sorts of stuff related to PFAS, $2 billion, and then an additional 500 to the Department of Defense, Department of State. So all of these grants were being given. And a paltry 21 billion is being given for basically water stuff. And not all of that, it's just being given to communities. Some of that money is still being given to businesses. Here in Vermont, Casella, the only landfill we have here in Vermont, got a huge amount of money from basically a grant to do a PFAS treatment facility at their private landfill. This is a private company making huge profit, but was given a huge grant, tax incentives. We do that all the time with these. And yet we have communities here that can't afford to overhaul their wastewater treatment plants or to do their water. So I think we need to prioritize how we're spending and these grants that we write that are supposed to be making a huge difference. And we need to admit that we can't really have a green revolution to save the climate if we're using PFAS and everything that's going to save the climate. I am not opposed to finding alternative energy, but I am opposed to using dangerous chemicals and increasing the production of those chemicals in order to, quote unquote, save our climate. We can't pit one against the other, and we need to put research money into safe alternatives. So those are just a few of the things that I think are hugely important in seeing the bigger picture and the interconnectedness between things. You know, we need to ban PFAS. We need to fund safer alternatives. And we need to look at how we're distributing government grants and monies that are supposed to be helping either climate or the environment, and whether they're really doing it in the end.
Absolutely. Thank you. And before I pass it to Kathy, I just want to let everyone know, if you want to start dropping some questions for the speakers in the chat, we'll use the last couple of minutes that we have to get some of our attendee questions out to the panel too.
Carmen, so You probably know, if you pay attention to anything with the Farm Bill, that the Farm Bill is currently under discussion in Congress. If you don't pay much attention to the Farm Bill, that may be something that you are less aware of, but it's one of the largest pieces of legislation that ever goes through Congress. And it's, as a consequence, covering such a wide range of issues. It's difficult to address a lot of them, but just a few things that I guess I would highlight as some of the key issues. One is the Agriculture Resilience Act is what's called a marker bill that outlines some of the ways in which the Farm Bill needs to better address climate solutions. So that one is really focused on, I would say, that the scientific approach to what's going on in agriculture and trying to decrease greenhouse gas emissions overall. You can find a lot about that one on the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition page. I used to write about that one when I was with them. And another one that's important is the Increasing Land Access Security and Opportunities Act. That's one that's supported by the National Young Farmers Coalition. And that's really key for helping farmers who otherwise don't have good land access to get access to land. And then, like I say, they're just such a wide range of issues in the Farm Bill. I would say local foods broadly are a really important one. That's one that I would also look to the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition to get some information about. And then a little more broadly, the Heal Food Alliance and the Native Farm Bill Coalition both have a lot of really important priorities listed on their web pages for the Farm Bill. So depending on what aspect of agriculture is interesting to you, all of those could be great sites to get started with some activism on the Farm Bill. And every single one of our representatives will be voting on those. A lot of them sit on committees that affect agriculture one way or the other, whether or not they're on the agriculture committees in the Senate or the House. So it is worth reaching out to whoever your representatives are, both at the state level to help push local food access and at the federal level to ensure that a lot of what we want to see for more equitable provision of climate solutions and of water pollution solutions happens in this Farm Bill.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I'm seeing some questions in the chat. Carrie is asking if any of y'all have relationships with farm worker organizations and can speak a little bit to the work that they're doing for climate justice and, you know, access to a healthy ecology.
I could kick that off. I don't work directly with farm workers, and our organization generally doesn't. We work with the people who are running the farms, but all of them, of course, have relationships with their farm workers. And a lot of the work that is going on with farm workers that we're seeing is in line with some of the climate impacts, for example, that we saw here in Albuquerque last summer. It's trying to ensure that they have the protections in the case of these extreme heat events that we're starting to see more and more. And so that means making sure they have official breaks for water, official breaks for rest, official shade spaces to keep cool and all of that. And all of those things are just utterly vital for ensuring that our agricultural workers, who are among the most threatened by heat events of any workers in the country, have the kinds of protections that they need. I think of the Coalition for Immokalee Workers as one of the key forces on a lot of that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think, you know, that's such an important reminder too, that it's all so connected, because I feel like I'm thinking about what Mary was speaking about earlier about Flint and all of these other communities impacted by water crises, thinking about the way we treat our farm workers. You know, our economy cannot function if the people who make up the economy are, you know, getting heat stroke at work or unable to access clean water in their home for bathing, for drinking, for cooking, for cleaning, if they're taking their kids to the hospital because they had to bathe them in a creek because their access to water got turned off. That is all, you know, it's all so interconnected that we cannot talk about these things as resources and commodities without talking about the fact that our economy requires that we have access to healthy land, healthy water, free from toxins. And so thank you for that. I think that's a really important reminder. I also see that folks were talking a little bit about money reform in the chat. Totally understand if this is not an area of expertise for folks, but I'm curious if anyone does have anything that they want to say about the way that our current monetary system and our monetary policies are affecting equitable and sustainable access to clean water, fertile soil, pollution-free air. This was also a question that we got from a couple of people on the Eventbrite registration form. So if anyone has anything to touch on there about sort of where currency reform and monetary reform could play a part, people also mentioned sort of reciprocal economies and stuff like that. So I'm just curious if that's something that's come up for any of you in your work as well.
Well, I'll just say something, and probably it's my bias, but I definitely believe we need to cut the military budget. Huge and big time. And the reason is that, something like an F-35, it's going to get more and more and more costly. In fact, the weapons of war are just going to get more costly as the technology improves. And already, every bomb that we drop, everything that we put together has PFAS and chemicals in it. And the military is not cleaning up their messes. They're not cleaning them up here, and they're not cleaning them up around the world. So if we had a priority for the military at this point, I think they should clean up the toxins and take care of the communities that they've polluted. And the truth is that they have allotted less and less and less money to the cleanup component than they have in the past. So I'm not feeling good about that. The other thing is we have to get rid of tax incentives and, tax write-offs and whatever, and these grants that give so much money to businesses that are already making a huge amount of money. Like there's a new coalition, it's the CHIPS Communities Coalition. It's everywhere that communities have semiconductor making facilities, whether it's Texas Instruments or Intel or Global Foundries. And these are companies that have huge numbers of environmental violations, abuse of workers, unsafe working conditions, and we're giving them federal grants. Now, that I have a problem with. We should not be giving grants to people who already have environmental violations and other violations. So we need to rethink how we're giving out this federal money. We give it to communities, but you have to pay half or you have to pay this amount, but it's pretty much a gift to industry and, and to businesses. And some of these businesses just don't need it. They make so much profit. So if we rebalanced in some simple ways, the ways that, all of us, I think, could see, we'd have the money for our communities, for the water infrastructure so that our personal water bills don't go up. When with these new drinking water standards, we shouldn't have to pay for the contamination that companies like DuPont and 3M have known about for over 50 years, if not longer. So that's my feeling.
Thank you, Marguerite. And I see Elizabeth Green in the chat talking about carbon credits. We did also get a question submitted in advance about the idea of a carbon credit or social credit system in the economy. Kathy, I'm curious if that's something that you can speak to in terms of how you feel like that benefits or changes the game when we talk about a healthy ecology and a healthy economy.
Yeah, so I would say I've been fairly influenced in this coming from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition most recently. We've written a lot about the problems with carbon credits, the inequities that they create, first of all, because as you pay people who have land for their carbon sequestration, what you end up doing is putting more money in the hands of those who already have substantial agricultural capital. And by and large, the solutions that we see from farmers, those who really are engaging in substantial carbon dioxide solutions, nitrous oxide solutions, and all of that, they are doing that by diversifying their systems very broadly, which is not something that most carbon credit systems pay for, nor effectively register in any way. Those farmers who are really doing substantial greenhouse gas mitigation within their farms, those are not the people that are receiving the carbon credits. The carbon credits are encouraging people to get temporary payments, and then they tend to fall back again, oftentimes, if they aren't being continuously paid for the system, and they can't be continuously paid because they've already used those credits on the land. So it's a rather faulty solution for what is a very complicated problem that's really about diversifying ecologies and thinking about the land in a different way.
Thank you so much for setting the record straight. That's great to know. And yes, as Dee Dee Purshouse just said in the chat, that so much of it is false offsetting. So it's just, I think it's important that we all know that there is this other side to that conversation about carbon credits. And I think we are running out of time. I'm going to do one last question, and we sort of circled this before too, but I'm just curious, we've talked a lot about problems. We've talked about solutions. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I always like to end it on a hopeful note. So before we bring up some of our final slides and thank everyone, I would love to just hear what gives the three of you hope in the face of all the formidable challenges that we're up against when it comes to trying to have a healthy ecology and a healthy economy. And I'm not sure who has not gone. Mary, I feel like we haven't heard from you in a second, so I'd like to start with you.
Sure. What gives me hope is that we do win. We can and we do win, especially at the local level. We have stopped hundreds of water privatizations at the local level. We've passed water affordability programs at the local level. So we can win, and it's about bringing people together. And often the victories that are happening are at the local level. It can feel really discouraging fighting at the federal level, internationally, but we can win. And it's about bringing people together on finding solutions that impact people's lives around their food, their water, their planet. So people are winning. Don't worry.
Thank you. An important reminder. And what about you, Kathy? What keeps you hopeful?
Yeah, I think the fact that people are beginning to look at food solutions as being something that's very broadly informed by not just environmental solutions, but also real social change is really important to how I think about this. People are really gaining an ability to speak with their own voices and protect their own resources and land. And as we get to that point, I think we start to hear more about different ways of thinking about how we use our resources and how we use our land, how we interact with the other life on Earth. And that's very exciting to see that we're really starting to change mindsets in a lot of places.
Wonderful. Thank you. And what about you, Marguerite?
I think I'm going to go with Mary. At the local community level, that's what I see is so positive and powerful. Seeing people who learn something and then want to put it into action and want to make a change. And if each of us just worked at making our little corner of the world the best that it could be, that would be a great beginning. Learning what we need to learn in order to do that, and to be in harmony with our environment, with the planet. So I would agree with that.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you, Marguerite, Mary, Kathy. Thank you for being here tonight, for sharing all of your knowledge with us, for inspiring us, for telling us what we have to do after this conversation. And we're obviously very sorry to be out of time, but thank you to everyone who came. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our sister sponsors for this event, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and WFAN, which I should know what that acronym stands for, but I'm just gonna, there we go, the Women Food and Agriculture Network. I'm like, let me refer to the slide. We are not done honoring Mother Earth and talking about ways that we can make a difference. We are actually having a conversation next Monday on April 29th for a wonder with AEO sister and ally Georgia Kelly, as explaining her work in cooperative economies and engaging with Oriel Osprey Lake about her new book, The Story is in Our Bones. So Thank you for, I think Stephen might be dropping the link in the chat to RSVP. If not, you can find it at aneconomyofourOwn.org/events and RSVP. And thank you everyone for being here. You'll receive a video recording of the talk. We'll send you that curriculum for further learning. And please do make sure that you keep in touch with us. I think the final slide, we'll talk a little bit. I think we might have to hit it again to trigger all of that. There we go. You can find more on our website, on our YouTube channel. We have all the recordings of our past Zoom of Our Owns. We have a newsletter. We blog at Medium. We are everywhere on social media at Economy of Our Own. Stephen dropped links for our giving circle. It's a way to make sure that we can keep these conversations going and keep AEOO strong. And we have lots of conversations throughout the year. So make sure you send us suggestions and ideas, show up in the audience and in the chat, and keep in touch. Thank you everyone for being here. You'll hear from us soon, and happy Earth Day. Bye all.